papal intervention on the climate change debate that some believe will transform the global conversation on an issue which has divided politics in this country and many others. The Pope's call to action comes in a dramatic encyclical, much of which was leaked earlier this week, an act the Vatican described as sabotage against the pontiff. Earlier this evening, his hand-picked climate change advisors and representatives from both Eastern and Western churches released the encyclical at a Vatican press conference.
The Church must now introduce in its teaching about sin, the sin against the environment, the ecological sin.
Well, and what's widely being seen as a rebuke to climate change sceptics, Pope Francis has railed against those who sought to dominate and pillage the earth, transforming it into an immense garbage dump.
Never have we mistreated and offended our common home as we have in the last 2 centuries. If the current trend continues, this century could see unheard of climate change and an unprecedented destruction of ecosystems, with grave consequences for all of us.
Pope Francis suggests this is a consequence of the human heart wounded by sin. So will the Catholic Church now define inaction on climate change as sinful? Well, the Pope directs his message to the powerful nations who will meet in Paris this year to set emissions reduction targets.
With regard to climate change, progress has been deplorably scarce. The reduction of greenhouse gases requires honesty, courage and responsibility, especially by the most powerful and the most polluting countries.
Well, powerful US Republicans, who are also conservative Catholics, have already responded to the leaks.
Religion ought to be about making us better as people and less about things that end up getting into the political realm. So I'm a little skeptical about this.
The Pope can talk about whatever he wants to talk about. I'm just saying, what should the Pope use his moral authority for? And I would make the argument.
He would say he's protecting the earth.
I would say that that's an important thing to do, but I think there are more pressing problems confronting the earth than climate change.
Well, others have leapt to the Pope's defence, including one Brazilian climate action group, which in rapid time produced a satirical movie trailer.
If we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. It's time to take out the trash.
A pontiff fighting for God's creation.
Come on, Your Holiness.
Tireless. Fearless.
This hope must be stopped. Coal, oil, gas, these are God-given gifts, and they are ours for the taking.
Unstoppable.
Forgive me, Father.
Nature never forgives. If you slap it, it will always slap you back.
Nature never forgives, indeed. Well, shortly we'll be joined by 2 prominent Australian Catholics to debate the implications of this extraordinary move by a Pope who seems set on defying all expectations of what he should do. But first, how will the Catholic Church in Australia respond? Melbourne Archbishop Denis Hart is president of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, and he joined me just a short time ago. Archbishop Hart, thanks for being there.
Thank you, Tony. It's good to be here and good to share good news with you.
Is it now a sin in the Catholic Church to be a climate change denier?
I think the Pope has put it front and centre that climate change and the needs of our world have to be part of the program of all Catholics. I won't speak more about the morality of it, but I would say that this is a thing that we've really got to think about seriously.
Well, let's talk about the morality of it just for a minute, because he says this: violence in the human heart wounded by sin shows itself in the symptoms of disease that we see in the soil, the water, living creatures and the air. Humanity has disappointed God's expectations. So isn't the Pope himself redefining the Church's response here to environmental damage through the lens of sin?
He's saying that we've got a serious obligation to be responsible for our brothers and sisters, to be responsible for the world. And if we do nothing about that, then we are doing wrong, yes.
How will the Church in Australia respond to this? Do you think we're going to see this message, the encyclical message, broadcast from the pulpits of Australian churches?
I think the message will gradually spread that we can't just go ahead with the culture of waste, with allowing ourselves just to consume, and think of ourselves and not think of anyone else. And therefore I think from our pulpits, these matters have got to be put to people, that we are brothers and sisters. We have to care for our common home, the world.
And a particular message on climate change action, because he's focused on that so clearly.
He spoke very clearly, didn't he? You know, just how a quarter of the world's population live on the seashores, and if there's climate change and the sea levels rise, that endangers humanity. And he spoke so clearly about our responsibilities to the poor, our responsibilities not to waste. And I think this is something that is really convincing, and it's not only just where he describes elsewhere about the weak responses of international conferences about what we should be doing and the need for courage, but he's speaking about what you and I and everyone else should be doing to conserve paper, to provide adequate water, not to waste, not to think of ourselves, not to think of, well, perhaps I could have more heat. Do we really need all the heat we have? Do we need all the air conditioning we have? He's saying all those things.
Yes, we've already heard criticism from prominent conservative Catholic Republicans, some in the presidential race. They're essentially telling the Pope to stick to issues of theology and morality, to stay out of politics. So has Pope Francis crossed the line at all here into politics?
I don't believe that he has, because he's speaking to all people of goodwill. He's trying to point out an urgent need for the world. He's not providing all the solutions, but he is providing the questions that we need to grapple with. And I think he's right in doing it.
What effect do you think the Pope's words will have here, where senior people within the church, within your own church, and senior people in government of the Catholic faith have been climate change skeptics?
I always have hope that particularly when the Pope writes and he provides reasoned statements and information, that will lead to a careful consideration of the arguments he uses and therefore a greater awareness of the points that he makes. Now, what effect that will translate itself into in various people here and there, I can't guarantee. But I think it is a serious encyclical. It's 106 pages, it provides the challenges, it's well-based and well-balanced, and I think we've got to respect that and take it for what it is, and take what the Pope says with his good advice to be carefully considered.
Does it have a clear political implication, though, in the lead up to these climate change talks in Paris, where the world essentially is going to have to look at each country at looking at setting much higher emissions reduction targets to battle climate change, according to most of the scientists and according to most observers?
I think this is what the Pope meant when he referred to weak responses in previous conferences, and while he wouldn't be looking politically at this one conference, I think the implication for the future, for the whole of humanity, whether on the big picture, on the world stage, or whether in individual relationships and care for rich and poor, the provision of jobs, the non-exclusion of people, or whether on the other hand the non-exclusion of parts of the world, allowing crops to grow and so on, all of these things are now being taken together. And I think for the first time the Pope is doing this. Other popes have spoken about the beauty of nature and looking after God's gift. This Pope is saying, hey, we have a responsibility for our brothers and sisters, for our home. We have to conserve it, we have to look after it. To fail to do so would be highly irresponsible.
Now, I can't let you go without making this point. The most senior Australian in the Vatican, Cardinal George Pell, he, back in 2011, went on the record decrying climate scientific consensus. He described the climate movement as totalitarian. He compared the carbon tax to a primitive sacrifices made to the gods and so on. Has Pell now been trumped by his own Pope?
George Pell, of course, is a classmate of mine from seminary days.
I'm aware of that.
And you're aware of that. I think things have progressed, and I think in the way that the Pope presents the whole matter, it will lead to appropriate consideration. I can't speak for someone else who's entitled to have their own view, but it's certainly what the Pope has said has moved me to consider the whole matter much more seriously, and I would be encouraging my fellow Australians to really think about what the Pope's saying and to think about the link between human beings and the environment and the balance of the whole issue, rather than focusing just on one or 2 points within the issue.
And what about your fellow Catholics in, let's say, the ministry, in the cabinet, and indeed right at the top, the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott?
Look, I would believe, I trust our leaders in the community to look carefully at the arguments the Pope makes, to review them, and to take stances in the light of that review. But I would respect people their right to have that view. For me, the argumentation is compelling and is certainly worthy of consideration.
Archbishop Hart, we'll have to leave you there. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us tonight.